So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to the 6th annual workshop of the Scaling Up Development Outcomes Community of Practice. I am Jonathan Papalides. I co-chair the group on scaling in fragile states with my illustrious colleague, Rob Chase, who you'll meet in a moment. And we're delighted to welcome you today to what is going to be a fascinating, important and urgent conversation about scaling social protection in fragile contexts. We're delighted to have you, especially those who are joining us for the first time, who may not be members already, but are interested in potentially staying engaged and joining at some point. So let me say something about the community of practice and our particular group on fragile states, and then we'll hand it over to Rob to tee up the discussion. So our community of practice has been around for about 7 years now. We've grown to about 800 members in over 100 organizations, and this spans multilateral institutions, bilateral donors, universities, think tanks, foundations, NGOs, and members of the business community. So it's a very diverse and rich community that has been really founded around the mission to improve the practice and professionalization of scaling in the development sector. And one of the ways we've done this is to grow out now what are 9 working groups in development focused on scaling in areas of health and education and food security and social enterprise and entrepreneurship, and also including ours, which is focused on scaling in the very hard places. Our group has been around for about 5 of the 7 years and has increasingly focused on about 3 or 4 themes that tend to be the most interest to our members. One theme is around the political economy of scaling. So how does the politics and the power distribution in a particular country help to drive scaling in some of these places, but also to hinder it? The other is a look at how do we consistently incorporate resilience approaches inside scaling to help manage shocks and stress and try to get to some of the root causes in some cases of scaling, of fragility through widespread approaches that can help potentially change patterns of cooperation and engagement and checks and balances. The other is looking at how do we include or adopt more adaptive management methods. So we're continuously learning as we go what works and what doesn't. And again, also trying to be more shock responsive through a set of different tools and applications that are increasingly growing in the development sector. And finally, we're looking at the so-called Nexus approach, humanitarian development and peace interventions, and how can scaling potentially harness some of those interventions. For instance, how do you finance from humanitarian to development transitions? Or how do you crowd in expertise from the peace building community to really help scaling in particularly conflicted areas as well? So that's sort of a broad introduction both to our group and the community of practice itself. We are a voluntary organization and all of our events are free of charge, as is membership. We publish a newsletter quarterly that tries to bring together the insights and learnings from all our different working groups, as well as feature and profile some of the work of our members as well. As we go along today, we'll put in the chat box some links to our website and to our Twitter handle and our hashtag. So if you'd like to live tweet or check out the website, learn more, register to join, you can have those resources available to you. And please do use the chat box otherwise in order to contribute to today. Comments, questions, insights, and feel free also to feedback to us as well directly to Rob and I, or to the folks that curate the community of practice as well. You'll find the resources on the website, but we also have our emails that are available too. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Rob, and again, a warm welcome.
Thanks, Jonathan. And let me echo and reiterate what Jonathan has said. Very warm welcome to members of the Scaling Up community of practice who we've been able to work with over some time, but also to new members or people who are interested in this specific topic or on scaling more broadly. Look forward to an interesting, exciting conversation over the next 90 minutes or so. And so it's my pleasure to introduce the topic that we'll be discussing today, but also to introduce a very, very distinguished group of presenters who will get the conversation going. let me frame the conversation briefly by describing social protection is a term that or an area of practice that relates to building systems for resilience. And those systems for resilience are often targeted towards risk management, particularly for some of the poorest and most vulnerable members of society. And so that risk management with a focus on those that are most vulnerable is obviously something that needs to operate across all types of institutional settings. But what we're speaking about, particularly given the focus of this working group, is the way in which in a fragile or conflict affected setting, it's clear that the risk profile has really been elevated, that there are more risks or more fragility or more ways in which volatility can operate. And so that therefore the risk profile being elevated, the needs or means, the necessity of putting together social protection systems or social protection operations are elevated as well. And so there's a particularly poignant time and situation to be working on social protection in fragile settings. At the same time, as we'll probably be discussing, fragile and conflict affected settings are places where by definition institutions are weakened or less able to be responsive. And so it's that's heightened necessity, but also greater difficulty that I think makes today's discussion particularly poignant. Look forward to having, as I said, 3 excellent presentations coming at this in some ways from different angles, but I think towards some of those central themes of how does one scale up social protection activity and outcomes for social protection, which is risk management in a setting where there is a fragile environment. So to speak through the run of show a little bit, first, very, very pleased to welcome my colleague at the World Bank, Ugo Gentilini, who is our global lead on social assistance in the World Bank. And as Ugo will attest by his presentation, he has a fairly encyclopedic knowledge of the breadth of how social assistance activities are happening around the world, not just in the World Bank, but across with governments, and we'll be sharing some of those sort of synthetic insights about how in fragile settings and in crisis situations, social protection and social assistance systems have been scaled up. Ugo has been, as I said, he's currently at the World Bank as global lead on social assistance, but prior to that has also worked in the World Food Program and is also an author of several well-reputed pieces, including one, and Ugo, I don't mean to, one that is in draft that we're all looking forward to seeing on some of the history of social assistance over time and some of the ways that the themes that we'll be discussing today do carry on from long-standing conversations. Michael Manavu is also a colleague of mine at the World Bank, so I'm grateful to have those 2 World Bank colleagues join us today. And Michael is our task team leader for the Ethiopia Productive Safety Net operation in Addis, based in Addis, and has extensive experience with working on the operations side of trying to figure out how to do social protection operations in difficult settings. Prior to leading our work in Ethiopia for the World Bank, he led our work in Uganda, and prior to that in Kenya. I should say that Mike well, usually in Ethiopia, is now in Nairobi, and that speaks a little bit to some of the fragility that we're currently addressing in Ethiopia, and some of the need to make sure that we have systems for resilience and risk management in its own right. And then after Mike speaks a little bit to the specific example of Ethiopia, really grateful to welcome Pallavi Roy, who is a lecturer in international economics at the Center for International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS. She is the research director of the SCDO's Anti-Corruption Evidence Research Partnership Consortium, working on issues of how one addresses corruption and fragility in several specific cases around the globe, and really grateful to have Pallavi speak as a discussant on some of these issues. So after those three first presentations, the run of show will be that we'll open it up for discussions. And as Jonathan has said, we welcome comments in the chat, people raising their hand to give questions live, and then we'll benefit from the inputs of these three distinguished commentators on the issues of social protection systems in FCB settings. And then look forward to a very, very rich conversation. So without further ado, let me turn it over to you, Ugo, to frame some of these issues for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Rob. Thanks to you and Jonathan for having me today. I'm really delighted to join this panel with Michael and Pallavi. This is a topic that is really core to what we do, I think, at the bank, but also for the social protection community more widely, as you nicely framed it, Rob. But before getting straight into fragility-related issues, I just wanted to take a second to situate the conversation within the broader ecosystem, the global ecosystem, and I think in many ways the historical moment for social protection that we have been witnessing over the past 18, 19 months. And Rob mentioned history at the beginning. If those among you that are passionate about the topic, it's hard to identify a moment in history that has seen this sort of scale up globally in social protection by virtually any metric, whether it's coverage, whether it's the generosity of transfers, whether it's spending. We have seen a massive growth in both the number of countries that have introduced measures to counter the effect of COVID. You see the bars are the number of countries which are over 200, but also a number of measures. These are over 3,000. As of May, we have an update of a tracker that tries to codify those experiences, and there is at least a 30% increase. So in a few weeks, you're going to see an extra bar and an extra point for the line added. But there is also, I mean, the response has also been quite uneven across countries and contexts. Overall, we have seen quite a fast response to the crisis, but average numbers, of course, conceal best and worst performers, and we have seen a lot of variance around that. Programs were mostly of short duration and seldom extended. And as I'll also show, spending in low-income countries and fragile states was generally low. But there has been a lot of action in both low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, fragile states. And if one takes the classic typology of responses, whether transfers have been scaled up vertically, meaning giving more to existing beneficiaries, or horizontally, reaching new places and new people previously uncovered, or just making programs being easier to access. We have seen a range of experiences. Michael will talk about Ethiopia, but if we think of the kind of profiles of beneficiaries that weren't previously reached, I mean, informal sector workers, the experience of Sierra Leone is quite fascinating. The extension of provision of social assistance in urban areas, which are oftentimes the center of gravity for a number of fragility-related issues and political discontent, that occurred in 11 countries in Africa. So quite a fascinating agenda on how to adapt programs in those environments. But also, I think the crisis has revealed how creative countries have been in working under a high degree of stress and reaching people for whom there was no information to start with. So, of course, you want to increase coverage, but how do you do that when you don't have information about those people? And here, from DRC to Nigeria, Togo has been widely documented. We have seen really ways in which information systems were either created from scratch, new ways of thinking of data collection in partnership with the private sector, mobile phone companies, tapping other databases of the health sector, or using civic registries or voter registries. It's been quite I think a tour de force of experiences there. And what is also interesting is that a number of those practices, sort of first generation practices, are now being in several cases being institutionalized. So you really see how the crisis had operated within sort of pre-existing structural gaps, and some of those creative solutions in the short term going to prove quite useful moving forward. So there is this sort of second generation adaptation as we go along. And zooming into fragile states in particular, here are four stylized facts based on data from both our from our tracker, the May version, and the picture is one where we see lower level of coverage, about 13 percentage points lower from kind of the average of non-fragile states, which is about 1/5 of the population. Then you go down to about 1/10 for fragile states. Much lower spending per capita. This is per capita in terms of population, $22 per person, about 7 times lower than in upper middle income countries, but much higher than the average in low income countries per se. What is interesting is also this measure of implementation progress, how hard it has been in some cases, if one looks at the difference between how much was promised and how much actually was implemented in practice. So you look at the actual versus planned rates, and you see kind of a difference of over 5 percentage points, which is not huge, but is significant. So fragile states have had more of a hurdle in following the plans, but also for people that were reached, so less spending, less coverage, harder to get to those people. But once the programs reach those persons, they are quite generous. So much more generous than elsewhere in terms of amount provided. Now, following through the theme of financing, it is also quite evident that the spending that countries are making and allocating for domestic safety nets programs is really dwarfed by the amount of international humanitarian assistance which flows into the country on average on a yearly basis. So it's really 6 times higher. and that goes back, I think, to a long-standing theme on how humanitarian assistance can strengthen medium-term institutions while also helping addressing short-term needs, and vice versa. How to make safety nets more shock responsive on one hand, but also flexible, and opening the door for complementarities. So, but this picture though show how the volumes or the relative proportion of those investments, and one reason for that happening, or why that dilemma that I just mentioned keeps being perpetuated over time, is the very tiny share of humanitarian assistance that is actually channeled through government structures. So if we look at the over 30 billion humanitarian assistance per year, just about 3% of that is channeled through local and national actors, and even a smaller share for governments. So basically, about 80% of that 3% goes through governments. So I would say about 2.8, 2.6 goes through governments. So these are facts from Development Initiatives that has a fantastic yearly report. And this is relevant if we also consider that the commitment at the World Humanitarian Summit of 5 years ago had the target of 25% of humanitarian assistance being channeled through local and national actors. So 12 percentage points different, quite behind from the target, and I think there is renewed attention to the theme, and this is particularly salient for an agenda like social protection that, by definition, uses national government structures. Now, if one looks also at why this is happening, it's also very clear that the entry points between the humanitarian assistance and social protection are quite different. There is an established literature examining that. I'm here showing just a visual from a recent report by ECHO, and also in terms of kind of the institutional architecture, the tools, the expertise that those two spaces tend to have, tend to be quite different. And recent surveys have, this is one conducted by CULP, the central figure there, really shows how also the humanitarian community perceives this divide of either lack of coordination or lack of expertise in helping bridging that divide. But I would also argue that that things are going better, that there is growing coordination, and that in part this is due to the growing use of cash transfers by the humanitarian community. About one fifth of global humanitarian assistance is now given in cash. But there is also, I think, a very sort of heterogeneous set of views within the humanitarian community, where some really look at working with governments as a natural entry point, and also I think within the social protection community there is a wider recognition that in some contexts it might be appropriate to work through non-state actors as an entry point. So I do see convergence there, and in fact, one way in which that convergence becomes quite clear, and one way that helps take part of the heat out of the debate and look pragmatically at how to better align those interventions, is by going granular and looking at function by function, things that humanitarians and social protection do in a similar way, if you wish. How can they made more deliberately connected and aligned? And this comes from work that we did with Karin Seifert and others. And if we look at, here is a dozen functions, and one disaggregates those functions, they don't necessarily need to go all in the same direction at the same time. and there could be a conversation on how to move in one direction or the other by those different through those different functions, and with a view of planning those steps. And there are several examples on how that is happening. There is work ongoing in the Sahel, mapping out exactly those different levels of alignment that are occurring as we speak, and build a shared understanding of what does it take to move a step further, a step closer to better synchronization with national systems. Sometimes there are special or particular quandaries that are faced, but overall we found this to be a useful way at least to frame the conversation and have a shared understanding about the challenges. And in fact, we do see a number of examples of, for example, in the financing where funds were pulled and channeled through government structures by the humanitarians. A critical point that is really close to my heart is getting or reconciling and harmonizing the way in which early warning systems can inform both the humanitarian scale-up and national social protection systems as well. Those are often, those upstream mechanisms are often not in sync, and that creates downstream coordination issues. So I think that's a very important part, especially as we think of more automatic triggers for scale up moving forward. Getting a harmonized approach on those issues is, in my mind, quite important. There are ways in which registration, identification of beneficiaries for humanitarian assistance is done by governments. So there are particular functions that are outsourced to governments, if you wish, and that is happening in Turkey, for example. One region in Ethiopia has a very intriguing example on a unified delivery system of targeting, transfer values, issuing codes, timing of transfers between the humanitarian assistance and safety nets, and that's the Somali region. Interesting paper by Sabades Wheelers and others that came out a couple of weeks ago. And you know, there are many other examples on how payments mechanisms were aligned in Lebanon, information systems in Chad. The humanitarians and safety net practitioners do have a shared data collection tool that goes into the national registry, or broader strategic partnerships happening in each area. So I see a lot of promising practices emerging within that big dilemma on how to better connect those words. So this is my last slide, and I would say, just to bring it all together, that when we talk about scale up, then the other question is, how far can national capacities go? But what do we need? What do we mean by capacities? How do we define them? How do we measure them? Do we have a shared understanding of that? And hence, I think having a unified, measurable way of understanding how far national systems can go, I think it's an important part of the conversation to put different actors on the same page. And here, I think we just had a tool produced, but there are many others available. Here we're trying to stress test social protection, just like banks are being stress tested, and looking at their ability to withstand large shocks and how prepared are they to scale up. We have the four classic dimension of adaptive social protection, disaggregated by 7 components and a system of scoring. And this gives you, a flavor of how prepared, how ready social protection systems are to scale up. But it will also, I think, be an interesting coordination device in calibrating the top-up support that humanitarian assistance could provide, but starting by having government and national systems as the default, but having a shared understanding that also there are roles within those functions that I mentioned earlier that different actors could play. So I would stop here, and thank you very much, Rob and Jonathan, for this opportunity to share a few thoughts on this important theme.
Hugo, thank you as ever. And just as anticipated, that's a lovely framing of with nice data, but also some nice conceptual insights about the scale up of social protection activities in the past few years and some of the modalities for how that scale up has happened, and also some of the challenges when you dig down into functions of what a social protection system needs to do, that those ways that those functions may be easier or harder in different institutional settings. Really, really very interesting. What we want to do next is to do a deep dive and give a specific case. And that specific case is one that if one follows the social protection sort of realm and some of the data about where programs have been operating at scale for a very long time, almost inevitably you'll turn to Ethiopia. And so we're very pleased to have Michael, who is the World Bank's task team leader for our program in Ethiopia on the Productive Safety Net program. Now the World Bank renames it as the Season Operation. It's the 5th round of that financing. And Mike, look forward to your insights about some of the ways to scale up safety nets in a fragile setting. For the broader group, we invited Mike to give this presentation before some of the situation in Ethiopia turns a little bit more risky. And so Mike, who would be giving this presentation usually from Addis, is now in Nairobi, his home city. So Mike, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Rob, for the introduction. And again, thanks to Rob, Jonathan, and the organizers for the invitation and the opportunity to share some of the experiences and reflections of the Psnp operation, particularly in light of the current situation in the country. I would preface by saying that it's a very fluid and unfolding situation. And so we're having to make decisions. When I say we, I mean, government, development partners, and the bank as we go along. So let me just provide a bit of background in terms of the Psnp operation. So this is one of the largest legacy safety net operations, certainly in the region. As Rob intimated, it has been in operation for 15 years, beginning in 2005. We're currently in the 5th iteration of the program, so Psnp 5, which is the government national program, which is then supported by 11 development partners and the World Bank, each contributing finances, operational capacity, and so forth and so on. I think that's an important point to note, that it's a government-owned program. It's a national program that covers all 9 regions of the country and about 408 districts or wards. Now, each successive phase of the operation has sought to make improvements in terms of the rollout and implementation of the activities. Rob will know this since he's been involved with the operation for many years as well. So while the program has tried to make innovations, improvements, etc., the core principle has been really the same, right? In terms of scaling up the national, nature of this program and providing core benefits in terms of cash transfers, of food transfers through public works, livelihoods interventions, and so forth and so on. So this 5th phase of the operation seeks to continue to provide the core support. But just to flag a couple of other elements, one of the key things is to try and modernize the delivery architecture of the Psnp operation, particularly focusing on the shock responsive elements that Hugo referred to earlier. So a lot of investments in terms of developing the early warning system, strengthening linkages between the humanitarian side and the development side, thinking about better structured drought planning processes, and also, strengthening the disaster risk financing elements of the program. So that's the vision in terms of where we want to go over the next 5 years. A key part of Psnp5 as well is to expand the coverage of the program, right? So as I indicated, we have currently been covering about 408 warreders, but the vision for Psnp5 is to expand to at least 70 new drought-affected warreders. And that process is in progress, despite the current situation in the country. And I'll come back to why I make that point. In terms of beneficiary caseload, it's a large program covering 8 million beneficiaries in the program, with the different interventions that I've laid out there. So let me make the point as well that, from the outset, the program was designed to address climate-related shocks rather than man-made related shocks or crises. And certainly not at a time when the country was in conflict or regions of the country were in conflict. The second point is that, the program from the outset sought to strengthen the sort of resilience building response to chronic drought situations in the country. So in a sense, to move away from the sort of unplanned, ad hoc, humanitarian, reactive responses to food insecurity, but to have a sort of more developmental, sustainable, long-term approach to addressing food insecurity. So having said that, we find ourselves in a situation of insecurity and conflict, starting from sort of mid of last year. Again, the program was not designed to be delivered in a conflict situation or to respond specifically to crises that are man-made or a result of conflict. Now, just some reflections on how the situation has affected the Psnp operation and its implementation, and how that sits with trying to continue to scale up the operation. So this conflict and insecurity started in the Tigray region, which is 9 regions of Ethiopia. And so all activities were paused in November of 2020, given the level of insecurity in Tigray. Now, as the Psnp operation, and given the dire situation of communities in Tigray at the time, I think there were about 2 million people in need of food aid, we sat with our government counterparts, development partners, and the bank team to say, what can we do to, even in a reduced scale, or altered implementation modalities, how can we still respond to the need in Tigray? And so we came up with interim guidance notes for how we could resume activities in February 2021, and we did manage to resume support activities in Tigray for a period of about 3 or 4 months until the situation did become untenable. I make this point because I think it's reflective of the fact that you can move away from your standard implementation guidelines and think about creative ways to say, how do we still provide transfers to communities in need in conflict affected areas while still maintaining adequate safeguard mechanisms and approaches, and continually assessing the nature of the risk in Tigray or a conflict affected area. So in our judgment at that point in time, there was still sufficient safeguard measures to continue to provide food transfers to these beneficiaries. Of course, the insecurity has now spread to other regions of northern Ethiopia, including Amhara and Afar. And I should say these are pockets of insecurity, right? So it's not the whole region, which is unstable, insecure, inaccessible, but it's pockets of these regions which are insecure, unstable, etc. And so the point here is that, we have adopted a sort of traffic light approach to say, for the green light, these are regions throughout the country where normalcy prevails in terms of conflict, security, etc. And we can continue to implement and expand and scale up operations in those areas, which I should say is majority of the areas in the country at the moment. We have the amber, light, for which, for example, in places where there are pockets like Amhara and Afar, the approach is to say, let us put in place adequate risk assessment mechanisms. Let's ensure that there's sufficient capacity, institutional, human capacity, physical capacity, and adequate safeguards and monitoring measures to be able to continue in the areas where it's accessible to provide these transfers. So it's a kind of case-by-case basis, depending on our analysis of the risk in these areas. And then we have the red light, which is, areas where it is untenable, simply because there's no infrastructure to be able to respond. And Tigray is an example in this case. So that has necessitated us to make some, adjustments to the program implementation, like I've said, including ensuring sufficient risk and mitigation measures. So, for instance, we are undertaking continuous conflict and security risk assessments just to inform our tolerance in terms of the risk. We're making certain adjustments based on the conditions on the ground. The Psnp provides support in terms of cash and food. So in many insecure conflict-affected areas, the financial infrastructure is simply not sufficient to deliver cash. And so, for example, in Tigray, when we did resume activities, we had blanket food distribution simply because there was no infrastructure. We have been considering third-party monitoring simply because, again, issues of inaccessibility, international NGOs, humanitarian actors tend to have a slightly better access to these regions. And so rather than having the sort of inbuilt program, government-led grievance redress and monitoring, to consider, using existing partners within the humanitarian space to undertake monitoring, but also, sort of supervision and grievance redress and handling, which is critical, particularly in conflict affected regions and those which are inaccessible, because information, I think, as Ugo said, is very lacking in terms of these types of regions. We made other adjustments in terms of, for example, suspending the public works requirements. The program does have public works in which community members engage in small-scale community infrastructure development in exchange for cash resources. Of course, in situations of insecurity and conflict, this is not possible. So again, we made decisions collectively to suspend the requirement for public works and just to provide food or cash where the infrastructure is available. So just to wind up, I think it's important to recognize this from our side. The traffic light approach, I think, helps us to frame how we approach implementation in different contexts within the country, which then goes to the point about needing to continue implementation in areas where implementation and scale up in areas where the conditions allow it. In areas where it's unclear, to quickly establish the status of the affected regions in terms of capacity, infrastructure, accessibility, and so forth and so on. And then make case-by-case decisions based on the information that's available. And the case I gave of Amhara and Afar, I think, apply to this. And then in areas where we have to pause activities, for example, in certain regions of Amhara and Afar, think about engaging different actors in the space. And again, here we're talking about humanitarian actors and international NGOs. Finally, just to emphasize the notion of flexing in terms of the implementation approach. So we do have implementation guidelines, but we have tried to be sort of flexible in terms of responding while maintaining a certain level of risk management as we go forward. So to conclude my reflection, scale up is possible in the context that we're talking about if there's government ownership and political will, if there's sufficient capacity to deliver to some extent, and if financing is available. And in the context of Ethiopia, financing is available. And so I do think that it is possible on this case-by-case basis to continue to scale. Thank you so much. I'll stop here.
Michael, thank you for that sort of deep dive into a very live and fluid situation. I really appreciate the way in which you're able to sort of give that calm reflection on a situation that is quite tumultuous, and to help us think through things that are happening in real time, but also to try to frame it with regard to the broader conversation we have in the scaling community of practice about options for the ways in which you can have systems that flex or that operate even when there are shocks. So it's a resilient system to build resilience is what we're looking for. I want to note that there's in the chat, there is a series of questions and responses being put forward, but to in some ways lead that opening up of a conversation, really welcome Pallavi to give any thoughts and reflections and see how we can relate this to some of the themes that we're grappling with on scaling up more broadly. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Rob, and Michael and Ugo, thank you so much. It is always such a pleasure to hear from those of you having information from the ground and being there as well. I think I was spoiled for choice in terms of what to start the discussion with, because I had learned a lot and I also agreed with so much of what you said. So I took the easy way out and thought I would begin with a few framing points informed by our research on anti-corruption and governance policy and how that might have an effect on productive sector outcomes. And we work in not very fragile contexts, but we do work in vulnerable contexts like in Nigeria, we work in Tanzania, we work in Bangladesh, Uganda, Lebanon, getting to be very fragile, unfortunately. So my first thought was really the first constraint and the real constraint, the binding constraint in FCV context is governance. Fragile states typically have poorer governance than in other developing countries. That exacerbates the political economy challenge. And in most cases, and as we've seen across, and hopefully that won't happen in Ethiopia, but there are real dangers there, that in most cases, rent capture, which is the governance constraint that we're talking about, is also along deeply sectarian lines, making social protection in such contexts very, very deeply political. So when responses have to be speeded up because corruption spikes as a result of the pandemic, governance becomes even more, as already weak oversight mechanisms become weaker. They're under stresses due to violence and due to fighting, and powerful clientelist networks can become stronger as they actually use their already relative power in terms of cornering contracts. And actually at this point then, social protection starts to become exclusionary, because you have so many cleavages in society at this point. So you're actually dealing not just with the technical political economy, if I may put it this way, but also sectarian and based on ethnic lines. So what Mike and Ugo said actually whetted my appetite even more, because it speaks to some of the work we are doing at SOASE. So I thought that I would like to know a little more as a researcher in terms of what you presented. So here goes. And then I'll build on to some more general points to conclude. I think in the second slide, what would be great for us when we are working with data as academics is it would be very good to get disaggregated data on how recipients were reached, where the constraints and leakages were. We know that it's happened in a really short time, but possibly in the span of these 12 months, it is possible to know what the delivery mechanisms were and where the delivery mechanisms actually fell short and how. And whether any kind of identification was used to reach recipients. And Ugo, your presentation did speak to that, and I will come to that. But some more specifics on it would be fantastic, whether they were biometric based or digital ID based, or the really innovative kind of GPS mapping, and I'll talk to why that becomes very important. Data on utilization rates for academics, and I'm sure for the policy practitioners too, that would also help a certain targeting, for instance. The examples from India, the examples from Nigeria actually tell us in the Indian case, if some of you had been following it, a lot of people also called it the Great Migration since the partition of 1947. And, some of us actually happened to be on the ground following that. And it was, nothing if not tragic, but actually social protection mechanisms couldn't keep up with that. And that really wasn't even part of the planning process. In Nigeria, though the government had a good enough plan, the fact that so much of the economy is informal meant that a lot of what Nigeria called palliative schemes weren't actually reaching the beneficiaries that were being targeted. What I found interesting from one of the slides was that where you talked about low coverage. So is it because the choice of delivery partners, the delivery mechanism was one reason why there was lower coverage? Because most of the funding seemed to be with national governments. Was patronage related leakages one reason for why that the two can sort of correlate? And this is where I got speaking to other conversations I've had with this group really, which is that would using multiple agencies at this point actually help not just deliver financial efficiency, but also wider delivery, wider acceptance, and wider uptake of these social protection schemes. Because governance and corruption related constraints that can actually hinder scaling up can be mitigated from the work that we've been doing, and we've actually been doing this work in Bangladesh on Bangladesh's COVID response, can actually be mitigated by involving, mobilizing multiple providers for each delivery goal, and not just depend on, let's say, the public healthcare system. Now that's possible in Bangladesh. It's not a fragile context. It has a very mobilized society. NGOs are very active, but variants of this framework where you actually mobilize multiple delivery partners might be a solution here for effective scaling up. And scaling can actually be possibly a means of risk mitigation here as well as economic mitigation, because risk mitigation politically you're moving away from the public systems. Of course, you have to work very carefully because this is the World Bank. These are large donors that we are talking about. It's not always possible to move away from the public delivery system, but with some kind of conversation with national governments probably, and economic also, because you're again not putting all your eggs in that public healthcare system or public delivery system basket. I wanted to focus a little more on the importance of how to scale up from the humanitarian aspect to social protection, which I think was a key part of both Michael's and Ugo's presentations. It's a different kind of scaling up. Adaptive responses are needed too. And I think here the point that both Ugo and Michael made about the early warning system is critical to transition to social protection. For instance, can early warning systems be adapted in a manner to make social protection countercyclical? Your early warning system is throwing up something, and then can you extend that? That there is a famine coming. There's some kind of violence affected crisis that's coming your way. So then can you start scaling up social protection programs in a countercyclical way? It really hasn't hit you on the ground as a social protection practitioner, but your early warning system is actually picking up something there. Can you then feed that into your data? So key here, of course, is the monitoring mechanism. And in fragile contexts, this could actually mean going as local as possible. And I would also like to bring in some bits of the work that we've been doing on digital identity and biometric systems in these contexts of social protection. And I think this would actually also be of value add in these kinds of fragile contexts. The use of digital ID or biometric systems is often linked to better monitoring. And the temptation to use these digital systems to scale up when you're in the middle of a double whammy, you have a crisis, you have people falling into precarity very, very quickly. You want to use these kind of databases to reach as many people as possible, because the intuition is, and it's correct in most cases, that you would be able to reach people better, more people better, if you have these kind of systems. But there is a serious question here of social protection sometimes being used for exclusionary reasons, and I'm actually saying this not from a fragile context, not from a context that most people would consider relate to fragile, but this is happening in the northeastern state of Assam in India, where India's UID system is actually being used to exclude the vast number of Muslim minorities who are actually Indian citizens from the entire social protection database right now. A National Register of Citizens was built. It was linked to the UID card. And if you weren't on that National Register of Citizens, which is built up in a very exclusionary manner, even if you had an Aadhaar, you just fell out. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen in these kinds of contexts, but it's something to keep in mind. If it can happen to a relatively robust, relatively stable system, it could happen anywhere. So these are just, checkpoints that one I guess one can keep in mind, because what research has shown is that these kind of systems, and this is true in humanitarian and social protection contexts, it reduces identity fraud, but it does very little to reduce eligibility or quantity fraud. And a number of research programs have actually thrown that up. So if you're thinking that, well, we can make people more eligible, we can actually reduce quantity fraud, that's not possibly the best use of it. And it all links back to this idea of monitoring and how do you prepare for a humanitarian response. And hopefully it won't happen, but in Ethiopia you have similar issues. Michael brought it up, whether it's among the Oromo community, the Somali community, even in areas like Sidama and Wolaita, which are extremely volatile right now, how these are used to scale up are possibly things that one needs to keep in mind. So possibly the next best means of identification, I think here the DRC example works very well, of GPS mapping. It doesn't always have to be other social registers that can be used. Do we have to go into sort of identifying, or can we just make use of what we have rather than building something completely new and digital? Those are things to be kept in mind. So I think I'll conclude by saying, what struck me from both the presentation is that there are three aspects of scaling up. One is, of course, scaling up the recipients of social protection. How many are we delivering to? How well are we delivering to them? The next important point is scaling up from humanitarian to social protection measures. I think here, when I said, can early warning systems be used to design maybe counter-cyclical social protection measures? So that's an important part of scaling up. But I think the most challenging part of scaling up is really leveraging social protection to improve livelihoods and make households and firms self-sustaining. Now, that's the ultimate goal, and that's genuinely the ultimate challenge for scaling up and adaptive responses. And I think there are lots of very, very stimulating conversations to be had on that. I'm mindful of time, and I know that there are lots of questions and lots of discussions to be had. So over to you, Rob. And thanks, Mike and Ugo. That was really fascinating.
Well, Pallavi, I almost want to turn it over to you, because that summary of the big issues about how do you deal with more recipients, how do you work on this sort of systemic movement from humanitarian support to government, and how do you leverage SP for self-sustaining livelihoods from the beneficiary perspective? You've basically said the World Bank strategy for social protection in Africa that I'm responsible for, one, putting together, and two, trying to figure out how to make progress on. So really nice framing. I'm going to give it to Ugo and Mike to respond to some of the points that Pallavi raised. And also, I think there's a nice opportunity from looking at the chat to weave in a couple of themes, and wouldn't mind your thoughts on any things that you saw from the chat, Ugo or Mike, in that order. I noticed a fair amount of conversation or questions about that, resilience requires looking forward into the future and sort of trying to monitor where some of these risks are coming before they hit, be they drought or weather related, or I think the one that's tougher for some of us is the conflict space where that prediction is not always so easy. I think, and Pallavi brought that up, but it's also in the chat. There's also, I think, some interesting points about the ways in which we can do better work on the systems, particularly of ID, and making sure that those ID systems are as inclusive as possible, with some counterexamples from Hassan, Pallavi. And also there's the question of how do we make real-time data available to a broader community, which was one of Pallavi's first points. So Ugo, you want to take some of those or different of those if you want, up to you, and then Mike, and then we'll, and if people have other questions, I'd like you to raise your hand or put it in the chat, and I'll try to get that in the order that they're posed. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Pallavi. These are very thoughtful questions, and you point to a number of salient issues. You spoke about the need for granularity for both research and operational purposes. The tracker that I mentioned at the beginning, and an update of which is coming out in December, does provide that granularity. So I'll put the link to the paper in the chat, but it's basically a 650-page review, country by country, of what's happening, and on digital transfers in particular, we have disaggregating information on payment modalities for 155 programs, and you see that 85% of them are paid digitally, and you know, by digital I mean whether they're paid via a fully functional account or a limited purpose account or an electronic non-account based method, while kind of the non-digital are mostly, you know, checks and manual cash. So defined in that way, we have 85% of the transfers being provided digitally. So that's in part because of the nature of the response that I think there has been even more attention to investments. There are a number. I mean, it's a it's an endless conversation, but let me just put out a few cases. I think that the fact that Togo established an end-to-end platform, electronic platform to start with in 10 days, and then that platform was compatible with payments made by different mobile phone operators, allowed them to distribute transfers to 450,000 people in 1 week. And that was basically 10 days plus 1 week. I mean, it's pretty phenomenal on how that happened. The way in which I refer to DRC, and since you brought up satellite images, that was the case for working in informal urban settlements, and their satellite images for vulnerable areas, and vulnerability was mostly defined in terms of exposure to floods, which occur quite a lot in peripheral areas and marginal areas in urban areas. That was used as a starting point, and then information on mobile phone coverage was overlaid, and then partnerships and non-disclosure agreements were signed with the mobile phone companies, who sent the phone numbers of people living there anonymized. Then messages were sent to those people and about the program and their willingness to sign up for it. And while agreeing by signing up, they would also provide information, and that basically constructed the database, a sort of social registry in that way. Then filters were added in terms of the type of mobile phone usage and contracts. So how much was spent and what kind of mobile phone one has. So a few filters were added, but so the basic point is there were opportunities to build up databases from near scratch, and that happened, and in a few cases that was done fairly fast. In some countries like Nigeria now, there is a sort of transition from those new interventions and get information back to the core system. And just in general, one observes that really the vast majority of the cash transfer programs implemented during the COVID responses occurs through new programs. And those new programs sometimes use existing information and sometimes collect the new. But that points, I think, to that earlier observation of the structural gaps that the crisis highlighted, and that people weren't just in the information systems, or those information systems were outdated. So there was a lot of learning in that regard, and technology did play an important part, and we do have the information on those responses. I'll just put them on the chat as we speak.
Thanks, Hugo. Mike, any points that you want to either reiterate or respond to?
Sure, just a couple of reflections. So on the systems modernization and the use of IDs and biometric approaches. So this is part of what is envisaged under the 5th iteration of the Psnp. So we're strengthening the electronic payments system, the management information system, and trying to put in place a beneficiary household registry, right, to support all of these data and identification needs. Of course, that has been affected by COVID and more recently by the context in which we operate. But I think this is the vision to have these mechanisms in place to allow sufficient flex in a timely fashion. I should say separately, the government itself is leading an effort to provide digital identification to the citizens. That hasn't really started in earnest, but I think the vision is to have a foundational ID that is biometric and that is not exclusionary and takes into account, I think, a lot of the risks, Pallavi, that you have just mentioned. Certainly, were such a system in place, we would be concerned particularly about the potential for exclusion that some of these systems might have. On the sort of scaling up from humanitarian to development, so my reflection on this is that there's always going to be, I think, a space for both types of approaches and interventions, and I think this has been brought home to me, particularly in the recent past with the current situation that we're experiencing, because there are spaces in which sort of the development actors are not best placed to respond, and certainly, in terms of conflict affected areas, I think there has to be a negotiation between these two spaces in terms of who is better placed, who has better sort of mechanisms at that point in time, even if you're pursuing a broader sort of developmental resilient building approach. So those are just my reflections on those issues. I think there was a question on conflict and risk assessment. So again, as I said, the Psnp was not necessarily designed with fragility and conflict in mind. The crisis that this program was meant to address are related to climate-related shocks, and particularly drought and food insecurity. We typically do have robust safeguards, measures, environmental and social safeguards, before we begin implementing any operation as the World Bank. It's only now, given the conflict that we're seeing, that we're having to interact with new tools, such as these conflict and risk assessments, which we have applied to, in particular, Tigray, to guide our decisions collectively about whether there's sufficient assurance that the program can continue to operate even at a sort of minimum scale. So that's a new tool, but at least we've applied it in one of the situations that we're dealing with. Again, with the early warning systems and this agenda that we have about strengthening the whole shock responsive safety net system in Ethiopia has been largely geared towards, responding to drought. I think now we're putting in a position, Pallavi, as you say, where we have to begin thinking about how do we weave in some of these other types of risks into our early warning systems and response plans ahead of time. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugo and Mike. I'm going, if you're interested, Johannes, you've posed some really pointed and topical questions in the chat. I'd invite you, if you would like, to give them verbally, just because I think they are quite poignant and right on topic. So not that I think I'm going to ask Ugo and Mike to answer them, because they are a big part of what we'll be working on for many years to come. But I think it's worth making sure that the whole group is kind of aware of those, because they really are spot on the kinds of things we're dealing with.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Let me maybe pick up what to me is the most striking, perhaps, aspect of the Ethiopia case, which is that you're in the fifth round of a program that now, I don't know, must have spent 10, 20 years potentially, and this sort of stick with it attitude of the organizations that are and partners that are supporting Ethiopia in this, to me, is really remarkable. Now, in my experience also, though, that is not the typical situation that, you know, the bank staff, bank project managers, the bank as an institution faces. You know, I may be wrong, as I've been long gone from the bank, but my impression is that in many cases where I've re-engaged with the bank, it's still very much the, let's be honest, the one-off project mode. And now that I may be wrong here, I hope I'm wrong, but how have you how can you, let me put it this way, how has the bank adopted its traditional project model to actually, you know, reflect the fact that these situations are long-term in nature? The need for financial support is long-term. The need for, in fact, for grants and subsidies is long-term. And, you know, the bank is actually not well placed to engage in those contexts. So is there something, number one, you can learn from Ethiopia example? And is there more that the bank could and should do elsewhere, in particular FCS contexts, to actually adapt its traditional model, a project model, and make sure that, you know, it thinks and acts beyond project end in a systematic way? Let me stop here. I have another comment, but this one is really my biggest concern.
Ugo and Mike, you want to see if you can address that, the issue that we deal with, I deal with, and I think Mike and Ugo deal with a lot, which is the classic sustainability question in some ways of, these are great supports, but are there plans both at the individual level, when we're talking about beneficiaries, and at the systemic level, to have those types of supports sustained? And also sustained in the face of risks. The scaling up and crisis in some ways calls the question. We're very counter-cyclical, as Ugo's research has shown globally, to scale up when there is a crisis, but that's financed by World Bank and other development partner money, and that is in some ways not as sustainable as we'd like it to be. Ugo or Mike, any reflections on this? And you're not speaking for the World Bank on this, guys. You just speak on your own perspective. Any thoughts?
I mean, I could come in with you know, a couple of brief reflections. So, I mean, you know, you look at a program like the Psnp, and certainly in other countries, there have been years of investment in terms of trying to build, you know, the capacity of individuals, households, and communities to be able, particularly, to respond to these types of shocks. So I think that's a big part of what we've been trying to do and what we continue to try to do. I do think that there will always be situations in which, regardless of how much resilience you build, that the shocks will be so severe that they're going to deteriorate whatever gains have been made. And in that context, we then need to think about, you know, how do we come in to address that gap? And in many ways, this goes back to the point that I was trying to raise about there's always going to be a space in which, you know, either shorter-term humanitarian type of support will be important. And then there will be situations in which it's possible to continue to invest in the sort of longer-term vision of building resilience at individual, household, and community level. I think a second point I would like to make is, I mean, I think So, one of the things that we've been trying to do is to invest in building systems, because from my point of view anyway, if you do have robust systems which are owned by government, then it forms the basis to quickly scale up or scale down as needed, be it beneficiary household registries, social registries, single registries, electronic payment mechanisms, robust identification mechanisms, and so forth and so on. And so I think that's a big part of the piece is let us invest in the systems so that should we be hit by these types of shocks going forward, that at least there's a foundation through which government can respond. The other point I would make, and final point I should say, is that much as there is external financing from the bank and development partners, I think, and Rob would know more about the region, but certainly in Kenya and now in Ethiopia, there's been a move to progressively increase the share of financing coming from government, from domestic taxes. So I'll give you the example of this phase of the Psnp operation, which is both an investment project financing, but also has what we call performance-based conditions. So we identify together with government key areas of the program in which government intends to make progress in terms of results against which we can release financing to them. And so one of these indicators is around, we want to see over the next 5 years the share of the government's contribution to the program increasing, and the share of the external financing decreasing, with a view, I think, to building more ownership and financing from the point of view of government. So let me pause here.
We'll go.
I think the financing point is a fair one. It is a big issue. The graph that I showed on humanitarian assistance being 6 times larger speaks to that point. I think the kind of the key issue here is what Michael, I think, just alluded to, is having perhaps a conversation on domestic revenue mobilization from the get-go. And I think if we look at the entire landscape of fragile states, safety nets are heavily externally financed, and there is the concern that the moment that funding is halted, the system may not necessarily be counterbalanced by an equal stream of domestic resources. There is, I think, a whole a whole branch of work in the bank, but also elsewhere, that is looking carefully at the domestic resource mobilization potential, and within that is not just collection, but it's also enforcement. There are, I think, it's a variety of specific issues there, but I think we need to better bridge these two worlds. Rob mentioned historical experiences. There are a few cases and interesting ways in which countries have evolved their funding composition, but also I think there is a lot of interest in the idea of what do we really need by sustainable. There are a lot of things that are currently done and that are funded domestically that are not necessarily sustainable. So I think there is a debate on how to repurpose and reprioritize some of those spending items as well. Energy subsidies is an obvious one, but it's easier said than done. The political economy or reform is very hard. Nobody knows better than Rob how hard it is. But also my last point is that we may need, especially when it comes to cash transfers, I think we need to redefine what we mean by sustainable in a way that combines fiscal prudence, but also with an explicit acknowledgement of the fiscal multipliers that those programs also generate. It's not just about the costs, it's also about the benefits they generate. I'm not sure how many investments are there out there that gives you between 0.3 and 2.6 dollars per dollar injected. That's what cash gives you. And if one is able to combine the agenda of expanding the tax base, those multipliers are what makes the pie grow. So if you're able to inject cash, that cash creates jobs and economic multipliers, you're able to tax away part of it, bring it back, you start creating that process. And then in the meanwhile, I think what COVID is also showing is the demand for this type of activities that is out there. I think those are some of the variables that together would help make social protection more sustainable. And I see early signs of movement in that direction. But there is also, I think, a component of shifting mindsets in redefining what is actually sustainable. And that's, I think, an important and oftentimes underrated challenge that we face.
Well, panelists, I want to thank you all for your presentation, and also to the participants for joining the conversation, for putting interesting and important questions into the chat or into the conversation. These are not issues that I think we're going to be able to wrap up too neatly or to come up with great solutions on, but they're the kinds of things that, particularly with fragile and conflict settings growing in at least in some parts of the world, and the impacts of those fragile situations on poverty and some of the most vulnerable, that we're going to need to be addressing. So let me see if I can very, very inadequately summarize a very rich conversation with a couple of quick themes that I heard. I think that one of the points that all three speakers spoke of is the way in which social protection systems are, by design, they are counter-cyclical. There is a push, there's a need, there's an imperative to scale up these types of efforts when crises hit, and fragile settings are obviously, by definition, places where there's fragility and crisis to address. That there are several different sort of types of that scaling up depending on what the environment is or what the crisis that you're dealing with is. For instance, different type of scaling up if it's a crisis that is related to drought than it is, say, in conflict, but that the weakness of institutions inherent in FCV settings makes that a particular challenge. So what we're looking to do is to build some of those systems for resilience. And so that was sort of the, how do we frame SP scaling up in crisis? I think there was a nice set of conversations about the link of, or the gradation or the potential link between systemic approaches to social protection that work with governments. And the World Bank is particularly focused on those links to government as its organizational strategy to scaling up, but also to humanitarian actors and other non-government actors, non-state actors that play a vital role in providing those counter-cyclical opportunities. And Mike, some of the examples you gave from what you're starting to deal with in Ethiopia about having to flex and be resilient as a system to do social protection in new settings, given the changes in your operating environment. And that gets to the third sort of theme, which is really better understanding of the risks and the overall operating environment. And as Pallavi, I think you wisely highlighted for us, and there's a data collection need, and we need to. There's also particular challenges of collecting data in fragile settings, but those needs and those challenges sort of march hand in hand, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't be as diligent and aggressive as we can in trying to collect that data. And frankly, what you highlighted, Pallavi, and others have highlighted is the use of technology to collect some of that data in real time. And I think that innovation is an exciting opportunity, but also there is that risk in some of these technologies about different exclusion groups that can be excluded. So I think that these, scaling up in crisis, links to the humanitarian community or risks are just a sort of thin veneer of a very deep and rich conversation that you have opened up, Ugo, Michael, and Pallavi, and really grateful to you for doing that and sharing with us those things. Let me stop there and hand to my senior co-chair of this working group to wrap things up, Jonathan.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you all for such a rich and fascinating discussion, which we will put on the website, we'll tweet out, and we'll put on our social media as well. And we hope that all of you that joined today benefited as much as I did from this conversation. Two things that really stand out for me around this is one conversation that we've been having in our working group, but in the broader COP around what do you scale? And my particular viewpoint is you don't scale a project or a pilot or an innovation, you try to scale an outcome. And it becomes really clear that when you can focus on scaling an outcome around social protection, or even beyond that for food security or the step after social protection, then you can have multiple pathways of getting there during humanitarian crises and more developmental times, etc. But that begs the question then, who does the coordinating of that? Who is the oversight sort of body that's trying to manage multiple pathways and learn and adapt in this, what Ugo called earlier, an ecosystem for social protection? And the Ethiopia case really demonstrates to me how the World Bank is really trying to adapt and work in this space of trying to be sort of not only a client-facing organization to the government to help it scale and own a social protection system that's responsive to the country and the needs, but in times of crisis where that system is compromised, how is it trying to work more in terms of working with humanitarian agencies and tapping those funding resources in ways, again, that both Ugo and Michael highlighted, aren't trying to create one project package intervention, but to understand that there are different actors all contributing to this one scaling outcome and the sustaining outcome as well, because in some cases you're not going to go bigger, but you're trying to at least sustain a floor of what's being provided. So it's fascinating to see the bank kind of stretching itself in this space as it gets more and more into the fragility space as well, and trying to mix in indicators around conflict and other kinds of risks, right? Because the social safety net started with droughts and lack of economic transformation in rural areas, and it's grown since then to more disaster risk areas and more urban areas. And now there's this additional layer of conflict on the social net, which again, for me, really emphasizes this point around you scale an outcome. And you try to bring an ecosystem into that with its own diverse principles, boundaries, but complementarities. And also in doing so, you try to find ways of complementing the existing government system, because that is where, as Pallavi referenced, there's a political economy around that. It helps to drive and sustain the social protection system to begin with, because it aligns with both immediate developmental priorities, but also political priorities. So how do you complement, work around in some cases, but build a social protection system, including identity tracking and registration, that fills out, recognizes the political economy and fills it out so that it becomes more inclusive over time and more resilient to more people. So fascinating discussion. Thank you all once again. We've put in the chat box some ways to stay engaged with us through our website, through our social media, and I've also given my email as well in case you'd like to participate more in our group and perhaps join it. So thank you once again to everybody, and especially our panelists and to Rob, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Nice
Thank
job.
you.
Good to see
Bye
everybody.
bye.
Bye bye,
Thank you.
everybody. Great job. Great job.
Thank you.